Over on Substack, the Unsolicited Advice Reading Group are currently reading Albert Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus. If you'd like to join us, the link is in the description. Tommy Blanchard, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
You've written an awful lot about neuroscience and the ways in which some popular presentations of neuroscience might just ever so slightly give a misleading impression. And you use a phrase in a lot of your articles that I really love, which is the seductive allure of neuroscience. That's been kind of rattling around my head ever since I read it. So would you just say a little bit about what this seductive allure is?
Yeah, absolutely. And unfortunately, I can't take credit for the phrase. So it's actually a phrase that you find out in the literature. So there was a big study quite a while ago now, and there have been a few follow-up studies that showed that if you give a psychological explanation of some phenomenon, people think it's a better explanation if you throw in just gratuitous neuroscience. So, you're giving your explanation of the psychological phenomenon, and you just say, oh, yeah, and the dorsal anterior prefrontal cortex is involved in this. And suddenly it's a much better explanation, according to the a lay person. Now, experts don't have this same thing. They recognize, oh, this doesn't actually add anything, and just kind of like cut that out. But to a layperson, throwing in neuroscience terms is found to just increase people's ratings of these explanations. And there's been a lot of research on like, why does this seem to be the case? It seems to be something that's particular to neuroscience. So you don't do the same thing if it's like a genetic explanation or something like that. And so my read on what's going on here is that people recognize, hey, the brain is this really cool, complex thing that we know is connected in very intimate ways to our thinking and our behavior. And so if somebody's saying like something neuroscience-y about this phenomenon, it feels like, oh, they must have it really figured out. Like they found this happening in the brain. They like if somebody mentions what's an example? Like I came across an example, the gift giving lights up the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And this is offered in an article about like how great gift giving is. And it's offered as if it tells you something additional about it. Just, hey, when you're giving gifts, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex lights up. And so suddenly the rest of the article feels like it has more credibility. But if you think about what's actually happened there, like they've just thrown out a term, they've put a label on like, hey, this part of the brain might be involved in this process, but they haven't told you anything about how the brain actually does that thing. Um, but for a layperson that doesn't fully understand neuroscience methodologies, it sounds like it's kind of pointing at, oh yeah, there's a mechanistic story here that neuroscientists have figured out. And I think part of this stems from um, uh, a misunderstanding of neuroscience methods, just how limited they are. So there's this great scene from, I don't know if you ever watched The Walking Dead.
Oh, my dad's really into The Walking Dead. I've seen bits of it, but no, carry on.
Okay. So there's, I don't even know, is it still on the air? I don't know. I was into it like whenever it was first on the air, but in like the second or third season, there's this amazing scene where the group has made it, I think, to the Center for Disease Control. They're trying to figure out, the cause of this, the zombie outbreak that. So for people who aren't familiar with the show's all about like a zombie apocalypse. Like 99% of the population is now zombies. So this group of survivors makes it to Center for Disease Control, trying to like figure out what's going on and how they can solve it. And there's like one scientist left at this place. And so this is the scene that's supposed to like explain everything about like how this zombie disease works. And he shows them a video of somebody, a brain scan of somebody undergoing the transition from being normal, healthy human to a zombie. And it's a brain scan. So like you see the video and it's showing individual neurons lighting up, and everything can be perfectly visual. It kind of like zooms in and zooms out, and then the whole zombie thing is like, oh, all of the brain activity stops, and then only the brainstem
Mm.
pops up again. But what I find amazing is like people thought this was credible, that you can like see individual neurons firing. Like this isn't just like, oh, that's a lot better than what we got. Like, no, that's like, something you should see on like Star Trek. Like that
Right.
is nowhere near where we are. Like any neuroscientist would sell their soul for a tool anywhere near as powerful and precise as that is. So you know, the other amusing thing about that scene is at the end, when the zombie transition is completed, the individual scanning their brain comes in and shoots them with a gun, which if you've ever had an MRI scan, like it's a giant magnet. It will rip that gun out of your hand. Like this is there are many things scientifically wrong with that scene, but um, so we have these media portrayals of what we're capable of with neuroscience, but that is not at all the reality. So, like an fMRI is the gold standard for human neuroimaging. So, getting a picture of all of the activity in the brain. All of those like pictures that you've seen in the media that have like some colorful splotch overlaid on a brain, those are all from fMRI. Um, and what they're doing is getting a not even a measure of brain activity. They're actually getting blood oxygenation levels in
Ah.
different parts of the brain, which correlates
Mm.
with neural activity. Um, and you have to do all kind of like it's the blood response is a couple of seconds off when the neurons are thought to fire and all that. So like
Mm.
there's all this like you're not getting a perfect picture of exactly what is happening, and the resolution of it. So you're not able to see individual neurons, and not anywhere clear. You're getting voxels, which is a 3D pixel, that are so big that you have tens or hundreds of millions of neurons in a
Mm.
single voxel. And then usually you're aggregating a whole bunch of those voxels together because like everything's so your measure of the activity at that level is so variable. There's so much what statisticians call
Mm.
noise, um, that you're then aggregating across a whole bunch. You're aggregating across multiple subjects because if you just look at one individual scan, again, the noise is just so high, it's hard to get um, uh, much of the signal out of all of that noise. Um, so what we're getting is very far
Mm.
from this picture of like, oh yeah, you can with an individual person, you can see every neuron lighting up. Um, so when uh, individuals come up with these explanations that use neuroscience, I think people have the kind of Walking Dead level
Mm.
neuroscience in their head, when really like in reality for um, all of these very high level cognitive processes, the neuroscience tools that we have to understand those very high level processes are pretty rudimentary,
Mm.
and are not very well suited to understanding these really high level things like creativity and insight and all of that stuff.
Mm. So there's a mismatch between the level at which and the way in which we're able to describe things at the neurological level and these kind of folk psychological categories, things like, yeah, as you say, creativity, insight, these kind of, these terms that are shaped by just our behavior in the world as opposed to looking at the brain directly.
Right. And like one way to think about it. So when we talk about neuroscience, a lot of the time people think immediately of humans,
Mm.
right? Because of course, mostly we're interested in understanding our own brains. That's like the interesting part. But I I don't know. I haven't seen numbers on this, but I'm willing to bet pretty heavily on it being the case that most neuroscience is done not on humans.
Yeah.
Um, And the reason for that is pretty simple. So neuroscience has a really hard problem. So the tools are amazing. But more important than that, we're trying to understand arguably the most complex thing we've ever come across in the universe,
Mm.
right? So a human brain has something like 86 billion neurons, and those neurons are all wired up. You have about 100 trillion synaptic connections in the human brain. So that's a lot.
Mm.
That's a lot more complicated than a supercomputer or
Mm.
anything like that. Um, so we're trying to understand this really complex thing, and then we have ethics, which it just totally sucks,
Yeah,
right?
that's just incredibly frustrating.
Yeah, you can't just take a bunch of people and cut open their head and put electrodes in there wherever you want and give them a lifetime of experience. Lock them in a room and tightly control their how they what they experience and how they develop. So you have us trying to understand the most complicated thing ever with a hand behind our back because of ethics, and then we just have crappy tools in the other hand. And so one of the ways that we get around this is, or attempt to, is of course using animal models. And so common animal models, and you can kind of imagine a spectrum here of oh, we really want to understand this complicated human stuff. Then we have monkeys that we can use, be a little bit more invasive with, but of course, there's still a lot of ethical standards with them. Rodents, which again, can't do anything with rodents, but there are fewer ethical standards. Drosophila, so fruit flies. A lot of neuroscience goes on with
Wow.
fruit flies. The other nice thing when we're getting this low, for
Mm.
rodents and fruit flies, and increasingly for monkeys, you can start using cool genetic tools.
Right. Okay.
So if we so a really sorry. Let me finish this. I'm gonna end up going in a
No,
million
this is
different
wonderful.
directions. Um, so Drosophila, and then you can go down even further. A very common model is C. elegans, these little roundworms that are they're
Wow.
about fully grown. They're about a millimeter long. So usually you're looking at them you can kind of
Mm.
see them if you're just looking at a petri dish with the naked eye, but usually you're looking through a microscope to see them. Um, C. elegans, they only have 302 neurons.
Wow.
They're always wired up the exact same way. Um, Now, here's the crazy thing. We still don't understand the C. elegans brain.
Really?
We know a lot about don't get me wrong, there's a ton that we know about it. There's
Mm.
a lot done. We know exactly how it's wired up. We know every connection because it's always the same in every worm. Um, and we've built a lot of models that capture a lot of components of their behavior. We still don't have a model that captures everything about their behavior. So there's still some things that we don't know. Um, and that should be surprising, right?
Mm.
We have the whole brain map.
Mm.
Why can't we just do it? And it just turns out an individual neuron is really complicated.
Mm.
And so the molecular mechanisms happening just aren't fully characterized.
Yes, one thing that I think a lot of people will be thinking is that we have a tendency when we're taking a high level view, at least for lay people like myself, to think of a neuron as kind of a binary switch on and off. But actually, within the neuron, there's quite a lot of complex chemistry going on, isn't there?
Yeah, there's an enormous amount of complex chemistry, and it seems like there are tons of neuroscientists who the whole thing that they study is just at the single cell level. They just want to understand a single neuron, what's
Mm.
going on there, there's constantly new results coming out of all of the complicated computations that are happening at the dendrites,
Mm.
for example. So the dendrites are the part of the neuron that kind of gets the input from the previous
Mm.
neuron. Um, Before that reaches the cell body, there's all kinds of cool computations that happen. There are people that spend their lives studying that. There are people that spend their lives studying the ion channels. So these are the little um, channels that open and close to let the charged ions that create the electricity that runs our brain, or that is used to signal through our brain. Just those pumps that like open and close and like send those like that's a whole field, right?
Mm.
Like you can um, talk to dozens of researchers whose labs are just about studying those kinds of things. So we don't understand C. elegans completely. We understand them a lot better than human
Mm.
brains. But the fact that we don't have that kind of fully captured yet should be a little bit surprising,
Mm.
and tell you a lot. Like, okay, then when we move to the Drosophila brain, that the fruit fly brain, there's a lot more complex behaviors. We definitely don't have a fly brain figured out. Move to the rodents, and again, we're adding more things that they can do. So, like in general, you should think anything that we're talking about. So, if we're talking about creativity,
Mm.
um, can a monkey be creative?
Mm.
Arguably, right? Like, but it's a little bit sketchy. Like a
Mm.
rodent, I don't know. Right, we're getting further and further from what we mean when we call a human act creative.
Mm.
Um, and that means we are more and more limited in the tools
Mm.
that we can use to try to understand that. So one tool, so as I'm talking about tools, like what are our tools? So I talked about fMRI for humans, kind of a crummy measure, doesn't give you great what's called temporal precision because of that lag
Mm.
in the blood flow. You can't tell exactly when the brain is being active. You don't have great spatial resolution for a human brain. That's great
Mm.
spatial resolution, but like you can't see an individual what an individual neuron is doing. Um, when you get to monkeys and sometimes in humans, so in certain if somebody's undergoing brain surgery,
Mm.
sometimes the surgeon will collaborate with a neuroscientist, and the neuroscientist gets to um, you usually put electrodes
Mm.
in the brain during surgery to like kind of make sure that the surgeon is in the right place. And so they have these electrodes in there anyways. Hey, let's get some data.
So
Well, like let's have the subject
yeah, is it
do
that
something.
every time someone needs brain surgery, there's a neuroscientist somewhere sort of rubbing their hands with glee and saying, "Yes, I get to get my hands on one."
Yeah, I mean, yeah, basically, like when there's a surgeon that
Mm.
like not all surgeons will do it because of course it complicates the
Mm.
surgery. So like it depends on the surgery, depends on the patient, depends on the surgeon, and all of that. So when all the stars
Mm.
align and you get to collect some data, most of the time during brain surgery, the patient is actually awake
Mm.
because you want to make sure you're not doing anything. If
Mm.
suddenly they're unconscious, that's a really bad
Mm.
sign. So keeping them awake and talking is actually like generally a
Mm.
good thing, and they can tell you if anything weird seems to be happening, and then you're like, all right, let's get out of here. um, and so you can record some. Individual neurons from a single electrode in a human brain. When neuroscientists are able to do that, that's like instantly, you're going to get into a high tier
Oh,
journal if
nice.
you manage to do a study like that. So it's like everyone wants to be able to do
Mm.
that. Um, with monkeys, you can more routinely do that.
Mm.
So a monkey doesn't need to be undergoing
Mm.
brain surgery for you to say like, "Hey, we want to record from this monkey's brain. We're just gonna like, we're not we're not gonna uh, do the kinds of things that we could do with C. elegans, but we can insert electrodes
Mm.
into a monkey's brain." So you can get more activity from individual neurons from that. Again, but you're literally sticking you're just sticking a wire into the brain. Like this is not like a very sophisticated
Mm.
method by any means. The more sophisticated ones, you put a whole array in, so you're just putting a bunch
Mm.
of wires in. But the advantage of that is these microelectrodes are very sensitive, so you can actually visualize the individual spikes
Mm.
of a neuron. So you mentioned, people think of neurons as on or off. What it really is neurons have what's called an action potential, or you hear people calling it they fire.
Mm.
Um, And what that is it's a short burst of high electrical activity. That's when they send the electrical burst down their little tail called the axon. And that's most of the way that neurons communicate with each other. The little electrical burst causes a release of neurotransmitters at the tail of the neuron that excites or inhibits the next neuron. Um, so um, you can visualize these spikes, and when it spikes a lot, like most of the signaling in the brain, it's what's the firing rate
Mhm.
of a neuron. So it's not like, oh, it fired once, that means something's happening. No, it's like it's firing faster now. It was
Mm.
firing slower before. Like that's the kind of thing that seems to carry at least a lot of the information. And so when you're able to get these individual um, recordings of neurons, um, you get to see what excites an individual neuron. And that tells you a lot about the kind of computations that might be happening there. Now, um, with the exciting thing when you get down to like rodents and
Mm.
Drosophila and C. elegans is you're doing more genetic manipulations. And
Mm.
what that allows you to do is there are certain genetic manipulations, like optogenetics is a technique where you actually genetically alter the neurons to give them an additional uh, uh, response to light. So
Mm.
these neurons are now going to be excited by light.
Ah,
Then you shine a light on them, right?
right.
And so now you can actually control these neurons with a lot of precision because you can just
Mm.
turn the light off and on. And so um, now you're able to start manipulating the neural circuits a little bit. And if you think about like how do we do
Mm.
science, right? One way, the way we like did for a long
Mm.
time back in the ancient world, especially, is you just observe stuff.
Mm.
A lot of the time, like that's all we can really do as neuroscientists. We can control like what it is we're observing really well, but we're not manipulating what's happening in the brain. When we get things like optogenetics, then you're starting to be able to manipulate things, and that tells you a lot more about what that neuron or what that circuit might be doing when you're
Mm.
able to like form a hypothesis about it. Now let's manipulate it and see if like what we expect to happen
So
happens.
you can begin to sort of identify a causal chain there.
Yeah, exactly. Um, and and it's not
Mm.
perfect. Like all of this is, you know, um, one of the hard parts about neuroscience is that we're limited by our theories in multiple ways. So if you want to understand creativity,
Mm.
um, what is creativity, right?
Mm.
What's
Yeah.
your theory of creativity? Um, so you're kind of you need to have a theory at kind of a cognitive level. And so I did my PhD in a department that was brain and cognitive
Mm.
sciences. And so I was, looking at actual neural activity, but a lot of the other labs around were doing computational modeling at the cognitive level. So not necessarily thinking about how is this implemented, but what are the computations taking place? And that's a very common way for neuroscientists to think about the functioning of the brain. So there's this very famous uh, way of thinking that came from David Marr, who is a vision neuroscientist, who broke, what does it mean to understand something in the
Mm.
brain? Well, he broke it down into three different levels. What we want to know is the computation level. So that kind of think of that as the highest level, and that's sort of understanding what is the problem that this brain area is trying to solve. You can think of it as like what's the input and output
Mm.
of this. The next level down is okay. We know what the problem is. What's the actual algorithm that it's solving? Like, what are the representations? that are there? What are the transformations that are taking place? This is still at a fairly abstract level, though. Like you're thinking of like actual code or something being written. Like that's very different than neurons. So the bottom level is implementation. So how do neurons actually do this? You think that what's going on is so like an example of um, an algorithm might be maybe it's some kind of Bayesian process.
Mm.
Okay, how do neurons approximate a Bayesian process? Right. Um, and so you can think of like, okay, if the problem is how do we identify uh, what's causing a noise or something like that, or how do we identify an object? There's kind of a high level computational way of describing that in a um, you need to make sure that the computational level is specific enough
Mhm.
that you can then describe what an algorithm might look like. And then from there, you need to be able to describe how the neurons would do it. Um, so when we think about something like creativity,
Mm.
what is the computational level thing? Like, what is the input and output for creativity?
Yeah, exactly.
I don't
It's
know,
very
right?
difficult to get a handle on what like I'm not even sure quite what I mean by creativity. I know that people who study creativity kind of have operationalized definitions, but then it's like, how do you translate that back into what we mean when we say that? So when someone says something like, "Oh, we've got creativity is associated with this brain area," or when it gets reported, sort of, and you've got a scientific paper, and then you've got the report in Psychology Today on the scientific paper, then you've got the report on BBC News on Psychology Today on the scientific paper, and then you've got somebody on social media saying, as a neuroscientist, I recommend you do this because it boosts this brain area to boost creativity. What is it once that final report gets to the layperson like myself, scrolling through social media when I should be doing something more productive with my time? What is it? What is the original scientific finding they're likely to be reporting? Will it be a kind of correlation found in an fMRI scan? Is that the most common one that will actually be the kind of where this claim grounds out?
Yeah, almost certainly that's what it is. So with those high level things, yeah, you're always looking at it's in a human brain, so almost certainly it's fMRI. Hopefully, like that's the best case scenario. There are other methods that are uh, better for some things, but generally don't have the kind of spatial resolution that fMRI does. So yeah, most likely what they did is somebody came up with some way of operationalizing creativity. Maybe it's, hey, so like there are a few different ways. So if I give you something like, hey, come up with 20 different ways of how to use a fork, right? Like, go, um, that's one kind of measure of what's called divergent thinking, which is one kind of way that psychologists think about and talk about a component of creativity. Now, okay, we have this idea that like divergent thinking is a thing that we identify as creativity. Um, and usually there's additional components on top of that. Creativity is usually defined as you need to do something that is you have to have an idea that is both novel and useful, right? So anybody can come up with novel stuff. Like
Mm.
it doesn't make it creative. My um, kids mutter gibberish all the time. That's not creative, but it is novel. And similarly, like if something's useful but isn't novel, like hey, I'm using a hammer to hammer a nail, like not creative. So usually it's those two components or something like that is how most psychologists think about creativity. Um, but now, how do you cash that out into a specific model? And so um, you a common way is to say something like, well, like it's probably um, we have two kind of things that you do corresponding to those two different components, generating ideas for the novelty, and then kind of selecting ideas, so filtering out the ones that are just like not useful at all. And that might happen at multiple levels. You might go, some people say, oh, maybe there's some kind of Darwinian process where, you branch out, generate lots of ideas, and then hone back in to select the most promising ones, and then use those to generate more. Most likely, it depends on what kind of creative task you're doing.
Mm.
And there's probably a lot of different, like if you're an expert painter, there's probably a lot of heuristics that you've learned of things that like kind of work well, in addition to some kind of like divergent and convergent process like I was just describing. There's probably a lot going on. So we can have different psychological level models of what we mean by creativity. Now, when it comes to neuroscience, we put somebody in the scanner and say, like, okay, here, like, fork 20 different ways to use it, go. Um, the, there's That's one particular task that we think does creativity that we would label as creative. That doesn't mean that all creative tasks are using those same brain areas are going to light up, right? Like this is a specific, like, it's drawing on your like knowledge of forks and like a very specific concept. Is that going to be the same as you trying to come up with a poem?
Mm.
I don't know. Maybe there are shared neural mechanisms. Maybe not. Maybe it's just something that we recognize at the kind of behavioral level. We recognize that, hey, these have some shared components in terms of them being both novel and um, useful. In for poetry, useful would mean something like evocative or like whatever. So, you know, neuroscience, when it's applied to these kinds of high level phenomenon, there's a lot that you can do in terms of the kind of cognitive science level, modeling these kinds of abstract things. Then going from that to the neuroscience might tell us something. Putting somebody in a scanner while they're performing one of these tasks, you might, for example, think, uh, oh yeah, well, just what I was just saying, like, is there a common creative process, or are they two distinct ones? That's a good neural question. Like you wouldn't be able to do a single study that would definitively answer that, but you could do a series of studies that would kind of, if you kind of triangulate both what the neuroscience is saying and maybe some behavior, right? Like, do these kind of creative traits go together? Do people that do well on one kind of creative thing tend to do well on another? Right? There's a bunch of different ways that um, we can try to triangulate the question of, is there a single creative process? And the neuroscience can weigh in on that, but it's not going to definitively tell you one way or the other. It's also not going to tell you how to be more creative, right? Uh, and I think that's one thing that we see online quite a lot with these kinds of reports that filter out, um, or like the wellness influencers or productivity hacks. Um, you see a lot of people using a lot of neuroscience words, um, and they might say, "Oh, yeah, the default mode network is involved in creativity, and so just act this way." And the problem with all of that is that there's so much going on in the brain, and like there are so many different mechanisms that you can talk about, like our knowledge connecting what's happening in the brain to these high level processes isn't great. And there's just better ways of getting at like what can improve creativity. You can just have somebody do, like, you have, like, it's fine to come up with hypotheses based off of our understanding of the brain. But then you can just go test those hypotheses. So does I actually saw a paper a while ago that was, based off of their model of creativity, that, to increase the divergence, maybe the brain just needs some stimulus. So what if we have like serve people random Wikipedia articles, I think it was, and then have them try to do something creative? Does that make them more creative? Right. Like you came up with a hypothesis based off of your model of how you think this works. Turns out it doesn't work.
Oh.
So and they reported the negative finding. Great. Okay, perfect. That's how science should work, right? But it's so easy because there's so many different neuroscience mechanisms, neuroscience things. You can come up with a story that sounds neurosciencey for basically everything.
Mm.
So I've seen a lot of these wellness influencers saying things like, well, repetition rewires. So, be careful about what you do. It's like, and they're referring to this well-known neuroscience rule called Hebbian learning, which is neurons that fire together, wire together. And so the idea is like this repeated action does rewire your brain. The thing is, everything rewires your brain, right? Like this conversation is rewiring your brain and my brain. If you remember anything past about 1 minute, it's almost certainly caused some rewiring in your brain. That's just how memory works. Um, so repetition rewires, sure, but also we also know that we stop paying attention to things that are repeated, like repeated stimulus gets ignored. We habituate to things, and so like no matter what story you want to tell, there's probably some kind of neuroscience-y sounding story that can back it up. So what you'll get is a lot of these truisms or like just generic wellness advice where somebody just kind of like sprinkles a little bit of neuroscience-y stuff top. Not saying anything wrong. Like it's true that that's a neural mechanism. It's just like you can just as easily pick a different neural mechanism and say something different.
Yeah, I've heard you use the term neuroscience garnish before, which again is that's wonderful. Just to kind of like, to taking something that is fundamentally just sort of maybe true, but doesn't really have anything to do with the particular neuroscientific mechanism being talked about, and then just sprinkling a little bit of like, and also this brain region is activated, just for like a little extra, to presumably to tap into that allure of neuroscience that makes it so seductive.
Exactly. And I think it's Dean Burnett, who's a great neuroscience writer who came up with that term. It's a great term, and you do see it all over the place. So you'll see articles that talk about the neuroscience of X, where X is gift giving or creativity or all of these other insight, and then you actually read what they're saying, and they just like kind of mention X involves, brain area Y, where like, brain area Y is some gibberish to the average person, right? Like the anterior cingulate cortex. Okay. Like what does that tell you? It's just a technical label that's being thrown on. And even so I don't want to give the idea that these kinds of studies are irrelevant. Because there's a reason that like studying creativity or insight can be useful for a couple of reasons. One is just like I said, it can add to our cognitive level models, like our kind of high level psychological models of what's going on. The other thing is I mentioned the anterior cingulate cortex, which kind of reminds me of this sort of joke from when I was in grad school of like anytime somebody got a neuroimaging paper, they'd ask, "Oh, hey, guess what area lights up?" Anterior cingulate cortex is always one of them. It's just this area that like it is involved in everything. And so there's something to look out for, which is another common thing you'll see in articles, which is reverse inference. So a reverse inference is saying, brain area X activated in this task, brain area X is implicated in behavior Y, and therefore X is an example of behavior Y. So we had people do this exercise, this brain area that lights up when people are doing creativity, uh, lit up, and therefore this activity is
Mm.
um, creative. Um, so that's what's called reverse inference, and you'll see this all the time in the actual scientific literature, as
Mhm.
well as in reports of like popular media articles reporting about these studies. And the trouble is, um, the layperson does not have any way of judging that reverse inference.
Mm.
Even for neuroscientists, it's hard. It doesn't. It's not always a bad thing. So, for example, like um, the amygdala lights up for your fear response. We showed a stimulus that we're pretty sure is scary. They acted
Mm.
scared, and we saw the amygdala light up. Like it's a pretty good bet that like yeah, that person was scared.
Mm.
Um, but it depends a lot on how uh, how many different things that brain area does.
Mm.
Most areas of the brain, especially when you get to the cortex, especially like prefrontal cortex, they do everything. They're involved in everything. Like they're just like um, give them a complicated, give somebody a complicated task, and like those areas will be involved in one way or another. And so um, it becomes problematic to say, "Oh, this area lit up, therefore, somebody was feeling a particular way,
Mm.
or the brain was solving it in this particular way." Because that part of the brain does everything. It's like the CPU in your computer is active for a lot of when you're running a lot of different programs.
Mm.
That doesn't mean that when you because it's active when you're playing a game. That means any other program that you run that makes it active is also a game, right? Like that's
Mm.
not uh, but that's the logic being used here. Now, there are certain parts of the brain that, yeah, they seem to not be quite so they don't do quite as big a range of things. And so you can do a sort of reverse inference. And there was actually a great paper, again, quite a while ago now,
Mm.
that uh, just took all of the neuroimaging literature and tried to see, like, okay, for different areas, how wide a range like, how confident can we be in different reverse
Mm.
inferences? Because you can just say, like, "Okay, how many different kinds of tasks has this area
Mm.
been implicated in?" And, sure enough, anterior cingulate cortex, that area I was
Mm.
talking about, earlier, it's basically like, you should never do reverse like, it just does we
Mm.
like, you can't tell based on it lighting up what
Mm.
kind of, cognitive process was going on. But other areas are a little bit better, and so you can kind of, actually kind of mathematize,
Mm.
how good, a reverse inference you do. But for a neuroscientist who has read, hundreds of studies, they have an idea of what these
Mm.
different brain areas are implicated in, the kinds of things that they do, um, and so they can kind of judge these reverse inferences well. What gets out into the public, you don't have that reference, right?
Mm.
And so you're completely dependent on whoever is telling like, if somebody's telling you, "Oh,
Mm.
this brain area is, associated with, um, social bonding,"
Mm.
you just have to trust them on that,
Mm.
and probably it is, right? Because everything's involved in everything, and so, like, it's just, like, the primary thing that
Mm.
this seems to be doing, is the real question. And so you can get a lot of these bad reverse inferences, leaking out into the public that seem to tell us something, but at bottom aren't actually that
Mm.
useful
Yeah, it
for
sounds like
the general.
a fair amount of this kind of, or a certain portion of this neuroscientific wellness advice, if we would kind of put it in an entirely different context, might be saying something a bit like, well, when you play chess, you use your hands. So if you want to become a better chess player, you should do hand strengthening exercises. And like it could because hands just ubiquitously involved in all of your life, and so yeah, maybe it will help. If you're having trouble moving the pieces along, if you really are struggling to grip onto them, it will help. But like clearly something's gone wrong here with our inferential process. If we're saying that, yeah, if you're struggling with your chess openings, you should really go and train your grip strength.
Right. Instead, what you should do, like if you actually think that's a viable hypothesis, okay, go train a bunch, like, instead
Yeah.
of trying to, like, study people playing chess and look at how they use their hands, just train a bunch of people's grip strengths and see if that makes them better chess
Mm,
players, right? And of course, you'll find they don't. And so
mm,
it's same thing with a lot of these claims about the brain. If they are trying to give you like a mechanism for how it works by pointing at the brain, oh, because the prefrontal cortex is involved in this, or because like, neuroplasticity is required for learning, you should do these kinds of things that cause neuroplasticity,
mm,
and then that'll make you learn better or procrastinate less or whatever. If they don't have a study that shows, yeah, doing this exact thing, the way I'm operationalizing it
mm,
caused the effect that you're looking for, then like it's just a hypothesis. It's
mm.
the inferences you can make are very weak because the link between the neuroscience and the outcome are so weak. The brain's just too complicated.
I mean, one of the things you also point to is that occasionally, when a popular neuroscientific claim is being made, sometimes the actual content of the claim is just like relatively mundane, but it's presented as something quite dramatic. So, I'll use an example of something that I was actually taken in by, which is love activates the same brain regions as addiction, which you mentioned on one of your blog posts. And you sort of pointed out that actually the regions or the extent to which they share similarities is just because they're both quite highly motivating behaviors. That's just the similarity is relatively sensible and mundane, and yet when presented as love is like addiction neuroscientifically, it sounds very, very dramatic.
Yeah. I mean, in a way, like love does have
Mm,
similarities to addiction, right? Like they both can motivate us. And that's
mm,
basically like all that the neuroscience tells us. Like
mm,
the reward centers of the brain that are involved in addiction, right?
mm,
There's tons of neuroscience research about addiction and how it happens. Yeah, and it centers on what people refer to as the reward system or the motivational system. The same system is involved in all of the activities that we are motivated to do because that's literally what it does. Like anything that you do it and think, oh, that went well. Um, yeah, your reward system did something there. Anything that you're motivated to do, it's because the reward system kind of like responded to that in the past.
I mean, something that I think is really interesting. Reading a lot of your blog posts, I get the sense, and I've had this suspicion in the past, that occasionally the layperson, very much including myself, sort of unconscious model of the relationship between the brain and the mind is almost dualistic still. As in, like, I think that a lot of people still perceive almost like the mind floating above the brain, and the brain more as like the thing constraining the mind, like as if the mind is this epiphenomena. So when someone hears something like, oh, this particular part of the brain is activated when I do this, they're thinking about like, oh, there's this thing upon which my mind supervenes, and any change in the brain is going to directly change my mind, which is just sort of a byproduct. It's like almost causally inert, which seems to me to be weirdly stuck between a physicalist and a kind of substance dualist uh, philosophy of mind paradigm. It's like it's caught in this weird middle ground because I think we have so much trouble actually thinking of the mind just as the brain.
Right. Yeah, and I think, I know you had, Lance Bush on,
Mm,
recently, and he talks about these experimental,
mm,
philosophy, looking these studies that try to look at, like, what are people's, pre-theoretical
mm,
understandings of, uh, meta-ethics. And, like, his argument is, like, they don't really have them, right? And I think that you can that's I suspect something very similar about,
mm,
people's, views of the mind
mm,
that, sometimes they're a little bit dualist, sometimes
mm,
they're a little bit like, they know that the brain does a lot of this thinking
mm,
stuff and whatever, but, like, they don't have, like, a very, like, hardened, like, understanding of, like,
mm,
how these things relate. Um, but it comes out in interesting ways when people talk in, like, this kind of therapy speak
mm,
and say, "Oh, you need to, calm your nervous system."
mm.
How is that different from calming myself? Uh, your brain learns best when whatever.
Mm.
How's that different from me learning best
Mm.
when whatever, right? Like, and so you'll see this. It's again, it's this neuroscience garnish,
Mm.
right? Sprinkling in is why you see it a lot, but people are attracted to it. I
Mm.
think because like it others your brain and your nervous system in an
Mm.
interesting way that like yeah it genuinely is hard to think about what the hard to think about yourself as brain, and it's hard like if you don't have a coherent kind of
Mm.
vision of what the relationship between mind and brain
Mm.
is. That makes it even more
Mm.
complicated because like I don't know, like yeah, I have a soul, I'm this other thing, and I'm
Mm.
not controlled by the brain or physics, but also I know that the brain and what's physically going on in it uh, causes me to do certain
Mm.
things. You know, it's a kind of complicated thing.
Mm.
So I think we get into these kind of um, funny ways of talking about it.
Mm.
Um, but since we kind of got onto the you know kind of philosophical views here,
Mm.
the thing I do want to talk about is just the one of the things that neuroscience really can offer us.
Mm.
Um, Which is similar to what I think a lot of experimental philosophy can offer us, which is just telling us how many of our intuitions are wrong. Uh, and, and so there's this great story. I want to say it's in a one of Daniel Dennett's books somewhere, but I could be wrong about that.
I mean, isn't consciousness
And
explained? I mean, consciousness explained is just enormous. So, like, there are so many
yeah,
things that I just
maybe it's
think are
in there
somewhere in
somewhere.
there.
I don't know. But there's this story of this person telling another philosopher about the concept of motion blindness. So motion blindness is this weird thing where
Mm.
uh, a person can perceive like their vision is fine, but they won't see things moving. And in certain there's different degrees of it, different types. It usually is caused by some kind of brain damage. So like the person had a
Mm.
stroke in a particular area. But they can see that a thing's here, and then they'll notice that it's over here, but
Mm.
they won't see it move from there to there, right?
Wow.
And so if you ask them, like, "Hey, is that closer now?" They'll be like, "Yeah, that's
Mm.
closer now," but
Mm.
like they can't perceive it moving towards them. And so this other philosopher said, "That's just not possible, right? Like that's just like that's incoherent. Like if you can see it at each moment." That it's in a different position. That means you perceive motion. Like that's what it
Mm.
means to perceive motion, right? Um, Turns out that's just
Mm.
not the way motion perception works. And so this is, I think, a really cool fact about the brain that, like,
Mm.
it's this thing that is both like so intimate to us, like how we perceive things, how things appear to us is so it's literally what we
Mm.
are experiencing. Yet we can be very wrong about what is and is not possible with it. Our
Mm.
intuitions are wildly wrong in a lot of situations. And this isn't like a single
Mm.
example of where like our intuitions might be wrong. There's like something that like blows my mind is attentional neglect. So
Mhm.
attention itself is a neural mechanism. Like there are
Mm.
specific parts of your brain that do the attention thing.
Mm.
um, and uh, some people with damage to, I believe it's the thalamus, will just ignore half. So you have one half of your thalamus damaged, they'll just ignore half of their world. They can
Wow.
see. It's
Mm.
not an issue of like they're blind or whatever, but they'll just ignore that part of the world. So
Mm.
the really like dramatic cases, you'll see people that like only shave one side of their face,
Mm.
and like this feels like it shouldn't be like surely you can just think about it and realize, oh wait, I only shaved half of my face, right? Like
Mm.
that feels like something that like would occur to these people,
Mm.
but just like their attention just never goes there.
Mm.
Right. So the very mechanism of like, you should just think about the other side. That's what's broken. Like, how can that break? Like that just when I'm thinking about my own experience, it just doesn't feel like it makes any sense. Yet we can find these cases where these specific mechanisms have broken down, and that like should shake our faith in our intuition that we have any idea how this thing that like
Mm.
is us how it works.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty intuition skeptic anyway, so you're somewhat preaching to the choir here, because I just think, like I think that there's a lot of intuition mining in philosophy of mind that I think is really quite unhelpful. Partly because I just think that a lot of it relies on us imagining what it would be like to be in a given scenario that we just have I just have no grasp on what it would take. And also, I think that we sometimes fail to recognize that you can discover that two things were identical that you didn't know before. So, my standard response to the Mary's Room argument, for those who don't know, Mary's Room argument asks you to imagine that there's a scientist who kind of studies color vision for their entire life and knows all of the true facts about color vision, but she lives in a black and white room. And then she leaves the room and she sees red for the first time. And the question is, has she learned something new? And, the kind of intuition that this is trying to kind of pump out of you is that, yes, she does learn something new. And so there is something it is like to see red that isn't captured by all of the physical facts you could study about seeing red. To which my general response is I just don't know. I have no idea what it would be like to know all the physical. I just think that I don't think that that's the kind of thing where we have enough empirical everyday evidence to then take our intuition out into that world. And especially considering that, if you were to ask somebody in the 18th century whether, Hesperus and Phosphorus could be in two different places in the sky, they would have said yes, despite the fact that we know that Hesperus and Phosphorus are both Venus. So I don't know. I think that I really like findings about the unreliability of intuition, because I just think that quite a lot of the time, a lot is hung on intuitive arguments where I think, I don't know, maybe, but maybe not. We'll have to wait and see.
Yeah. Well, I think another thing that, the Mary's Room argument, to me kind of, and the whole, what Dennett, again, calls the zombic hunch, where that kind of intuition comes from, I think, is this idea that, when we learn more stuff, we just collect facts. But if you think about and this gets into what neuroscience does and what it's all about, we're not just looking at, so I talked about Mars levels, we're not just looking at the implementation level where it's okay, we know the brain does something, we just want to know what those neurons are doing. No, we have this complicated feedback loop between where we're trying to figure out, okay, what is the problem that the brain's trying to solve? How is it doing it at a kind of high level description, the algorithmic level, and how is that implemented? Those all kind of change each other. How we approach the problem and how we think about it changes it as we learn things. So with creativity, to continue with that example, we have this model of it. I said, oh yeah, it's novelty and original usefulness. We can imagine learning more about creative things and realizing, oh, actually, it's better captured in this other way. We can imagine capturing that. It doesn't make sense to have this blanket category of creativity. Actually, we should break it down into there's visual creativity and physical creativity. Maybe there's different kinds. Maybe there's just some totally other conceptual system that kind of captures what's going on a lot better. Point being that our theories change, our concepts change as we learn the facts on the ground, and how we see those facts also changes as our theories develop and mature. And so it's not obvious that you can go from your current state of knowledge to what kind of concepts you'll have when you finish. So it's not obvious to me that it will always be obvious that you could separate function from the experience, right? And I think much more likely, as you gain more knowledge of kind of neural theories of behavior, eventually the concept of experience kind of slowly shifts and dissolves, and you break it up in different ways, and suddenly it's not so mysterious.
I mean, yeah, I think a good comparison here might be with phlogiston, which was the I don't know. I mean, I'm not no expert on phlogiston theory, but there's thought to be the thing of which heat is made. And if you were to frame all of your predictions and speculations and estimates on how future heat science was going to go, and you framed it all in terms of phlogiston, you would just end up completely down the wrong track. You'd think, oh yeah, we'll have some kind of, we'll know loads about phlogiston. We'll know like what it looks like under microscope. We'll know what it consists of. Maybe phlogiston is a complex object and it breaks down into simpler substances. But of course, our whole way of seeing heat has changed. We've not explained the concept of phlogiston. We've just discarded it and found that actually there's a whole another more sophisticated and ultimately more useful way of seeing heat. And is your point that something like this might happen with categories like experience, or even I don't see any reason why all of our kind of folk psychological concepts like fear and anger and joy will all survive this transition. It might be that because those were crafted in a practical world where we're all interacting with one another and we can't see one another's brains, and maybe a post knowing everything about the brain world will approach them entirely differently.
Yeah, I mean, I think a few different things I'd say to that. One is at least some categories we can just look cross culturally. Like there are some
Mm,
things that are just hard to translate.
mm,
Our concept of mind is different from the ancient Greeks. It's different from in Chinese cultures and and various other Eastern cultures. Like translating mental and some of the ways we talk about the mind just doesn't
mm,
work. Like there's just different concepts. It's just a
mm,
different way of breaking up what the way we categorize mental or mind versus behavior. And so, like, I think there's already examples that we can point to in that code. But I think uh, with experience, I suspect there's kind of like multiple conceptual things going on there. Like, I think part of it is it's just really hard to like describe this thing in the third person and then be like, and also that's me.
mm.
Like dualists have this nice like because there's so little known about the soul, it's not that
Mm,
mysterious, but like with the brain we can actually like dig in there and like figure out things. And so like it's becomes harder to see yourself as
mm,
that thing that's become a little bit more
mm,
described.
mm,
um and to the phlogiston kind of example, one thing that I don't think is very widely known is just like how early we are in neuroscience.
mm.
So like it wasn't that long ago, historically speaking, that, like, it wasn't known that the brain is the part that does the thinking stuff.
Wow.
So, like, go back, like, just a few centuries.
Mm,
I think it might have been, like, maybe by the 17th century, this was kind of settled, like, that
mm,
recent, that we were like, "Oh, yeah, it is the brain." And, like, you can find thinkers that suggested it was, the brain, all along, but, like, the heart
mm,
was, a contender
mm,
for, just as long. So, it was relatively recent. When did we figure out, that electricity is kind of
mm,
in the brain, that doing something in the brain, and how, like, nerves communicate to our muscles? That was, I think 1800s maybe?
mm,
Um, and it wasn't until, like, fast forwarding to, like, the 50s, 60s when we figured out very basic things, like we were talking about neurons,
mm,
firing, their action
mm,
potentials, that's the primary, like, way that neurons communicate. That was, like, the 50s,
mm,
that we figured that out, so, like, 70 years ago, like, I think Patricia Churchland actually makes this point in one of her books that, like, she was alive when that was
mm,
figured out, it's really not that long ago that we figured out this, like, very basic thing about how the brain even talks to
mm,
itself, like, how
mm,
communication in between nerves happens. Um but similarly, like, we didn't know that there are gaps, synaptic
mm,
clefts between neurons. That wasn't, like, firmly established until, I think, again, the '50s. And, was this Nobel Prize winning work from, like, the '50s to '70s that, really gave us the first hints of how vision, which was there's a huge amount of neuroscience on vision,
mm,
um, the first, like, ideas of how that works. And I think it's actually, like, um, there's this going into the details of how it works and the computations that are done um, is really helpful because like there's so much theory, and by theory I don't mean like people sitting in armchairs thinking, oh, maybe this is how the brain works. I mean like
Mm,
doing math that's far beyond me
mm,
um, uh, to craft models that kind of capture are kind of analogous to what we think is going on in
mm,
the brain, so that we can say, hey, we now have this model. What kind of things can it do?
mm,
And what you'll find is um, neurons following rules kind of locally are we know enough about the kind of molecular mechanisms that they do and the computational properties of those mechanisms that you can see how they're able to pull out patterns. And that's really cool. So they pull out these patterns, and then okay, now you have these patterns. So you can have other neurons that are pulling out patterns of those patterns,
mm.
and it becomes this very complex thing. So to make this a little bit more, if I can continue this crazy tangent I'm on for some,
No, absolutely.
um, to make this a little bit more concrete, so the visual system, it starts in the retina, and like I feel like at least the kind of education I got, it was like you know light hits the
Mm.
retina, that gets transformed into electricity. Oh, electricity is like the brain's native language, so like whatever, it's just like from there, whatever. Um, but it's actually really, I think, interesting how it works. So just going through like the early visual processing system. So
Mm,
how do you look around your world? We can see objects, obviously,
mm,
right? Um, but like if you think about what it would take to build a robot that's able
mm.
to navigate their world, you can't just like stick a camera on there and be like, all right, just gonna like route
Mm,
that input in. Like you need something to process that, right?
mm,
And that I think is one of this like hard conceptual thing that you need to wrap your head around to like really get in the mindset of brain as mind
mm,
is like no, it's not just going to the Cartesian theater
mm.
as Dennett calls it. You need something that can actually pull the information out of that. So photons hit your retinal cells. I'm gonna like a lot of this is
Mm.
gonna be obviously way oversimplified,
Oh,
but
yeah.
uh, your neurons, you have neurons in your retina. So fun fact, your
Mhm.
retina, which is in your at the back of your eyeball, is part of your brain. So it's a little bit of your
Oh,
brain that kind of pokes out. Um, so
it's
there's neurons, and
terrifying.
oh yeah, it is. uh, so neurons that are sensitive to light. So we were talking about optogenetics earlier. These
Mm,
are like the original neurons that are sensitive to light. This is why we have those kinds of photoreceptors. So they will change their firing pattern when they're hit by a photon. And we just have a blanket of them back at the back of the retina. And so, uh, let's say we have 3 neurons here, okay? We have, some photons coming in, excites these 3
mm,
neurons. There's, other neurons kind of lower down the
mm,
chain that they're attached to. Um, and these ones are wired up in an interesting way.
mm.
So, the typical way, um, uh, these ones are wired up is in a center surround fashion. So what does that mean? It means that so obviously it wouldn't
Mm.
actually just be 3 neurons or whatever. This is
Yeah,
very
yeah.
but this neuron is connected to it, and when it fires, this one will get excited. So it's more
Mm.
likely to fire or it will increase its firing rate. When this one gets excited, it'll lower its firing rate, and same
Ah,
with this one. So the center one will make it fire more. These
right.
two will make it fire less. And so why is that important? So like think about what'll happen if all of them are being hit by light. It'll be like, might fire a little bit more,
Mm,
might fire a little bit less, depends on the weights, whatever. Um, if just these two are, right, it might increase its firing. If just the center is, then it's going to fire more.
mm.
Why is that important? Well, because what it's detecting is contrast, right?
Ah,
So
yeah, of course.
that high contrast. And so this center surround um, kind of configuration allows you to get a neuron that instead of just responding to a single photon, now we have a neuron that's responding to contrast in your visual
Mhm.
um, experience. Okay, why do we care about contrast? Well, look around your room, like look
Yeah.
at me on the screen here, right? Like where is a point of high contrast between where
Mm,
my hair is and the lighter background behind me, right? So that
mm,
this is going to be lighter back here, this is darker here. So there's going to be a change in the number of photons kind of coming from that area. Cool. So we have center surround. Those neurons then are wired to something further down
mhm,
that learns, and there's learning rules for this. So like this is where it gets really cool because it's like self-learning and like it's
mhm,
responding to the environment that you're brought up in. Um, so uh, when our environment is structured in such a way, like natural environment, and also our artificial environment, in such a way that things tend to be there tend to be objects,
mhm.
and objects can have something called edges.
Mm,
What's an edge? So notice that it's not just a single point of contrast here. I'm like
mm.
weirdly pointing at my head here, but I think. But notice that there's a whole line here
Mm,
of contrast. And that's how you're picking out that, like, oh yeah, this is where Tommy's head is. This is
mm,
where his hairline is, right? Like these are the things that your visual system is picking up on. It's
mm,
the contrast and the edges.
mm,
And so this neuron down here is going to uh, so um, Heppian learning is
mhm,
this idea that what wires together fires together. So
mm,
why would anything want to fire together when it
mm,
or why would anything want to wire together with something that it fires together with?
mm,
Well, because if you think of there's a whole bunch of these neurons kind of in a row that are responding to contrast. If all of them fire at once, and that excites this downstream neuron enough that it fires, so
mm,
now it's firing together with these, that means it's found an edge. And that's a
mm,
common pattern in our environment because there tend to be
mm,
objects that have the edges of contrast. And so if our environment didn't have edges, if like just like this neuron would fire randomly and this one, like it's not going to, if there's just contrast over here, that's
mm,
not going to be enough to get it to fire consistently. But when all of them are fired together, that's going to more consistently get it to fire.
mm,
So by strengthening those, so it's going to strengthen those connections when it fires after all of them fire. And so by doing so, and like say there's another neuron that's like it's not part of the edge, right? Like
mm,
it's a contrast thing that's like, there's the line here, and then there's another one kind of
mm.
taking
Yeah.
pattern. That's not the way edges work. That's not how our environment is set up. And so it's not going to strengthen the connection with that one. It'll weaken that one. So just with this rule of wire together, fire together, we take those contrast detecting neurons and create edge detecting neurons that are going to detect edges of different orientations in different parts of our visual field.
Mm,
So now we have edges. Great. We can just kind of continue this story along. Right? I'm not going to go all the way down my arm and across my body. But you can continue this basic story, and what you eventually get, you go from edges to like shapes and corners. Again, depending on your environment, so it'll learn. Like if you're in an environment like we are, our artificial one, it actually changes what kinds of the distribution of the kinds of things in our environment. So our brains probably, like our visual cortex, probably responds a little bit differently to our visual environment than people that. Like hunter-gatherer
mm,
tribe that have less experience with, the hard edges that are so common in, our, environment. Um, and so you can start putting together these edges in different ways, make different shapes. Those shapes get, put together so that we're detecting different, uh, objects and things like that. And so just in that way, these very simple features can be built up into this more complex thing so that now we're doing object recognition and all of these much more complex things. It is crazy to think about our visual experience like that, right? Like the way that I just described it, it's like, wait, I don't notice the contrast like until
mm.
like, when I first learned this, I looked around and I'm like, oh yeah, okay, contrast
Mm,
is where I find, where one object starts and where it ends. I didn't know that before.
mm,
How could you be telling me something about like that is how we navigate the world? And I didn't understand that before. Like, that to me is part of the wonder of learning neuroscience is that you can like learn these weird mechanisms and how it happens and like how you would build something that does it. Um, and it tells us something about ourselves and the kind of creatures we are because we just by nature of being a brain doesn't tell you how a brain works. So it's
mm.
it's this funny vertigo that you get
Yeah,
when
I mean,
kind of being a brain looking back at itself.
I have a real affection for thoughts and question and like drawing people's attention to where kind of naive introspection really actually does break down. Eric Schwitzgebel uses the one where people systematically overestimate how much of their visual field is actually in focus. So you can do this right now.
Mm,
If you like pay attention to your peripheral vision, people watching at home, you'll notice that it's so much blurrier than you expected. And it's only when you draw people's attention to this that they realize this. And if you ask people before they are instructed to pay particular attention to this, they'll just say, "Oh yeah, like my peripheral vision is actually pretty clear, isn't it?" And then once you get people to do this exercise, they really revise that belief. It kind of does. It really disrupts this uh, long-held idea in philosophy that you have a privileged or infallible access to the contents of your own perceptions, because there someone else is able to correct you about the contents of your own visual field, which we think of as so intimate and private. And no, it sounds like neuroscience is full of that kind of thing where we learn that actually our naive introspection, which for 99% of our life is the only reliable way to get at this kind of information, and no one else is in a position to correct us. Like, no, suddenly someone's in a position to correct us about it, and I love that. It's kind of it has a real certainty disrupting aspect to it that I find really appealing.
right, and like you said, they're all over the place. So like more examples.
Mm.
Proprioception, right? People for some reason think we only have five senses. We don't. We have way more senses than that, or fewer, depending on how you want to like classify things. But we go through our lives relying on proprioception. What is proprioception? It's our sense of where our body is. And you
Mm.
might say, like, well, like it's my body. Like, of course I know where my body is. Like, right? But like, no, you need your there are mechanisms in
Mm.
your body for telling like there's neurons in the joints that'll send signals that inform my brain what position my arm is in. And my brain has a mental model of my full body, and therefore I can kind of like put together what the angles of my joints and like have this picture of where I am, and like it's just unconsciously just there until it isn't. So there are people
Mm.
that have again, we can look at the pathological cases, and these make it really salient when these
Mm.
things break down. So you can look at people that don't have proprioception. There's
Mm.
an actual, I think there's a documentary actually about it, about an individual that
Oh.
lacks proprioception, and you know what they have to do to walk. They need to look very carefully at their legs, and like
Wow.
this was a learned thing that they needed to like learn how to do. Um, uh, Took a lot of training because they don't have the feedback that we just take for granted. We just
Mm.
take for granted that we can walk without thinking about exactly where our legs are, and
Mm.
we don't need to like look at them unless we're like balancing and doing something hard. Um, that information is just there transparently for us, and we just take it for granted. But there are actual mechanisms that do that. Um, yeah, another example that's kind of
Yeah.
fun is um, uh, afferent copies.
Oh, what are
So
those?
if you think about, so you were talking about like our peripheral vision.
Mm.
Cool thing about our eyes, we are almost constantly making what are called saccades. Um,
Mhm.
so a saccade is just an eye move when you move your eye from one thing to another.
Mm.
That's called a saccade. A couple of fun things about it. You cannot smoothly move your eye. If you can either go from one point to another, or you
Mhm.
can follow something. So if you put your finger in front, you can move it smoothly, but you can't just
Mhm.
like smoothly. If you um, are able to look at your eyes really closely while you're just trying to go from like left to right or
Mm-mm.
right to left. You'll see it kind of like jumps. It's kind of
Oh
like
yeah, no,
jittery.
I can't do it. I'm trying it now.
Yeah.
I
um,
guarantee
so-
everyone watching this will be trying it right now. It's
yeah,
almost
yeah, and then
impossible
try
not
it with
to.
your finger.
Yeah.
You can smoothly follow the finger. So it's just kind of this funny thing. But our eyes also make what are called microsaccades. So like pretty much all without you noticing, your eyes are constantly moving just a little bit. That is for various reasons and helps us see. But a funny thing about the fact that our eyeballs move around, think about what's being projected onto the retina. Um, I've gone from looking here to looking over there. Uh, that's a big change in what's coming to my retina. And this might seem obvious, but um, I'm the one that did that, right? So I
Mm,
changed that. But what if instead it was from the room shifting,
mm.
right? I want to be able to tell those two situations apart because those are very different situations for me to be in. So how does the brain do that? Again, you actually need mechanisms. It sounds
Mm,
so stupid because it sounds so obvious that like I did it. Of course I
mm.
know, right? But no, the brain needs to actually build mechanisms for it. So there's what's called an afferent copy. So when you send the motor command to the muscles in your eyes that move your eye around,
Mhm.
another copy of that is sent to a part of the brain with the model of what's going on, so that it can kind of subtract out the movement and not
Ah.
attribute that to a movement in your environment. Instead, it's attributed to a movement in your eye. And this is also thought to be why we can't tickle ourselves. So we're
Ah.
actually we are subtracting out that touch. It's
Mm,
like we're not being surprised by it in any way because we have kind of the perfect prediction of
mm,
um, the what feeling we're going to have. Um, so again, things that like you wouldn't think you need a mechanism for,
mm.
turns out, yeah, there's all of these like pretty complicated neural mechanisms making your experience as seamless and integrated as it is.
Yeah, I think one of the things that seems to be a common denominator between a lot of these cases is that neuroscientific discoveries are very, very good at helping us realize all of those things we thought were inseparable are actually separable. And I think like clinical cases seem to be really quite stark for that because you read these and you think Oliver Sacks is now a bad example because of recent discoveries that he made a load of stuff up, but that used to be a really good appeal, and I'm sure that I'll just have to update my kind of knowledge of clinical cases. But you used to you kind of read about these where somebody has had a bad head injury and something has gone wrong, and then all of a sudden they lose a capacity that you think, wow, I just feel like that would just go together with vision, or that would just go together with hearing, or and it's amazing, I say, how separable and how unintegrated these things are in theory. And again, to take this back to our point about maybe the overconfidence that a lot of us put in our intuitions, in that intuitively you just think these things are inseparable, and yet we discover just how separable they are, and that's not something we could do from the armchair. That's something we have to go out and poke the world to discover.
Right. And I think another way that we can kind of discover this is and neuroscience is a great way of like forcing yourself to confront this is like think about what it would take to build that thing.
Mm,
And artificial intelligence is kind of getting better at it. Robotics is getting us further towards that. But it's just so easy to again, like you wouldn't think if you were building a robot, oh, I need afferent copies to subtract out the movement, right? Like that's such a weird thing. But I bet if you like somehow build a robot, put the cameras in, hook them up to the process, and then oh, let's put wheels on this thing. As soon as it shifts, the like it goes haywire because
mm.
it's like, oh my god, the world moved. Right, like, it would take that to figure out, "Oh, shoot, we need this mechanism." Um, and so thinking about, like, oh, what would it ta like, taking seriously this idea that, like, oh, mind is brain, suddenly you can't have this, like, complicated thing like the intellect, right? Like, if you
Mm.
go back, um, uh, hundreds of years, like, the chess and logic were thought to
Mm.
be kind of the pinnacles of intellect. And we realized, oh, we can build machines that do this way more easily than we can build machines that like can identify a bird. And so uh, suddenly we realize, oh, okay, like well, language and like you can actually like kind of see in people's pushback to various artificial intelligence creations, this kind of pushback of like, well, okay, sure you can do that, but you can't do these other things can't be broken down, right? So for like logic and reasoning, then we build computers that are better at logic than we are, that can beat us at chess constantly and whatever.
Mm,
Okay, fine. That's not the real core peop language, right?
mm,
And of course, now that's very but even like, if we go back, say 20 years, people were starting to build these bots that could do some natural language processing and
mm,
an okay conversation. And then it was all about like, well, but they can't do anything creative. And now you see, ChatGPT writing sonnets and whatever, and it's like, okay, like you can claim that's not creative, but like it really feels like you're just kind of straining for something here. Like, what really is the difference between what it's doing and what we're doing? And so I think like again and again, like we're kind of pushing back what we see as this irreducible
mm,
whatever thing, and realizing, oh yeah, all of these capacities we can build up in different ways, and that's cool. Like we
mm,
can learn a lot. I think we can learn a lot about language, both philosophically and in terms of like how cognitively it
mm,
works from looking at large language models. Because hey, we now have an example of a built
mm,
thing that has at least a lot of the properties that we
mm,
do in our language. And so I know some computational linguists that are really excited about this. Um, and it tells us a little bit about the kinds of creatures we are, right? We're
mm,
made of these weird, different pieces that are capable of these kind of like astounding acts that like we're slowly figuring out how they work. Now, we don't understand it all, and we haven't like even once we understand each of the components, like how does it all kind of come together? We haven't again managed that even in the C. elegans, the little two neuron worm. But like it's exhilarating to think that like, oh, like we once it all comes together, like that's us, you know.
I really like the picture of thinking about this in terms of different mechanisms, partly because I think that when people like butt up against the hard problem of consciousness and we think, God, I don't know how we could ever bridge this gap. I think that a lot of that is um, the fact that introspectively, kind of naively, introspectively, I see my experience as totally irreducible. Like, I don't know how I'd remove bits, add bits in. It becomes quite difficult. Whereas
Mm.
this kind of mechanistic picture, we can start to see, well, maybe, this bit fills in here and this bit fills in here. And eventually, you kind of take experience and you break it down into something significantly less irreducible. And
Yeah.
then I think that, we start to see a potential way forward for things that initially seemed like they were just complete hard blocks. How on earth could grey matter give rise to the seeming rich experience around me? It's like, well, maybe I think the point you made earlier about neuroscience being such a young science is really important. It's like, that there is a potential here that we're judging, say, early psychology and saying, oh, well, you can't predict exactly what people do. You can't explain this, this, and that. It's like, well, maybe, the field's not been around for very long. So like maybe give it some time. And yeah, and
And
also
like I
this,
said, it's the most complicated thing in the universe, and we're
yes,
doing
yeah,
it
yeah.
with one hand behind our back. Like, give us a break, you
And
know?
and I think that this mechanism, this way of viewing the mind as composed of different mechanisms, I think gives us a way to kind of make that hard problem just seem significantly less like it is just a sharp dividing line. Because we're starting to treat experience in the same kind of piecemeal fashion that we treat objects around us in a kind of piecemeal, breakdownable fashion. I know. I mean, what are your thoughts on kind of hard consciousness? How has your work as a neuroscientist shaped your view on philosophy of mind?
Yeah. I mean, what one example that I think speaks a little bit to what you're talking about is like I remember when I was, a teenager, having a thought that I know many people have of, how do I know that my red is the same as
Mm.
your red, right? Like, what if my red is your green or vice versa? Um, and then I read Patricia Churchland talking about, you know, the the neuroscience of color vision, and you realize, oh, okay, like that's not actually possible just because of two things. One is just the psychophysics, so the way that color perception works. Um, Colors aren't just like standalone things,
Mm.
right? So red um, has relations to all of the other shades of red. It's a darker pink, it's like orange without the yellow. It has all of
Mm.
these associations. So, like, okay, you have to preserve all of those associations with all the other colors. Okay, fine. But let's like, instead of just like swapping two colors, we can turn it or something. Turns out color vision is asymmetrical in certain
Oh.
ways. So like there's I'm gonna forget a lot of the details here, but like there's um three different dimensions that you can map colors onto. There's hue, saturation, and lightness, I think.
Oh yeah, it's
Um
in Photoshop. You got.
Oh, right, yeah, yeah. So you and so you can construct like what does human color perception look like and create this three-dimensional shape. It's not symmetrical. Um, I think it's yellow. We can perceive fewer shades of yellow. Like it just kind of turns into a brown earlier than like the other
Wow.
side, green or something like that.
Mm.
There's some weird asymmetry. Again, I'm probably getting some details wrong here. So you can't even just like turn this thing. Like it's just like this weird thing. Uh, but if you look at the response of cells in the retina, so the retina, we have three color sensitive cells, three cones, three types of cones, um, and they respond to different frequencies of electromagnetic radiation, also known as light. Um, so they will respond most strongly to particular band, but more weakly to other bands. And it's not like they're spaced out perfectly. I can't remember exactly the distribution, but two of them are a little bit closer than the other. Um, and then they're wired up, just like I was talking about before, with the contrast nerves uh, being connected with the edge detection. Similarly, there's connections between these different cones, and they're connected in such a way that they create an opponent process. So you don't just have, oh yeah, the red one uh, uh, kind of just gets connected, and that just goes, wherever in the visual cortex. It's like red versus green. I'm gonna get details wrong here, and but so you have this opponent process, and if you kind of like make a mathematical model of like, okay, what would this structure be able to detect based off of the response curves of these retinal cells and the fact that it's an opponent process, um, what falls out is something that looks very similar to the psychophysical 3D shape. And so it's like, oh, okay. So this like very naive armchair idea that I had as a teenager turns out when you like actually do the work, a lot of that just armchair thoughts just fall away, and like they're not
Mm.
relevant for how you think about color. And now suddenly, I can't think about color as this isolated the experience of color red isn't this isolated object anymore. It has connections with all of the other colors, and so like it is that experience is in a sense fixed by its relationships with the other colors. And I think a lot of the rest of our experience is like that. It's um, all of the downstream physiological, the memories, the concepts that we have, all these downstream relationships kind of fix what that experience is. So if you think of like what it is that we are,
Mm.
we're these um, creatures that make all kinds of judgments and all those. And certain of these judgments are kind of just are the experience
Mm,
of whatever. So when we see red next to green, what's going on is the judgment that these two objects are emitting,
mm,
on electromagnetic frequencies that have this relationship with each other. And so we are experiencing kind of that judgment. And that just is what experience is because we are the thing that needs
mm,
to make the action and do the thing. Similarly, like, why is pain painful? Well, if we are the thing that is in control of this body,
mm,
if it wasn't painful, if the experience was different in any way,
mm,
we would act differently. um,
mm.
so,
Yeah, this kind of these two things that seem like we were talking earlier about how neuroscience can make things that seem inseparable separable. This is almost the opposite of that, making something that seems two things that seem like they're separable. And actually, turns out you just can't have one without the other. This is a sort of a necessity that you discover in the world.
right. Like, you can't have me having the kind of conscious decision to run away from
Mm,
something without the physiological
mm,
responses and the experience that come with it. And it's that those relationships that are experience in to me. And so it's a kind of like weird way of thinking about this that like neuroscience kind of forces me into. It's like we're so used to looking around our world and having this kind of naive realism about
mm,
it, right? Like, oh yeah, I see the computer screen, I see you, you're a person, whatever, and I just have direct access to that. But when you think through that story I told earlier about what the visual system is actually
mm,
doing, that's not like it's pattern recognition going on
mm,
based off of photons hitting my eyeballs. Everything like is like, okay, photons hitting the eyeballs, and then I generate responses uh, in my muscles that create new, responses from like tactile sensors and stuff like that. Like all of this isn't grounded in some ultimate reality I have like I can touch and sense. I don't know what the essence of things is. It's this kind of like pattern recognition that the only way it the only thing grounding these different experiences to each other are other electrical impulses, right? And so it's all kind of relational rather than tapping into something kind of essential and real in some naive realist kind of sense. So to me, that way of thinking about it, that it's relational and therefore our experiences are related to the physiological responses that we have, is a much more valuable kind of way of thinking about it than thinking of qualia as this thing separate from the functioning of the brain. I think I don't know if I described that well, but like to me, that kind of suggests this relational framework where the relational functions being performed just is what the uh, constitutes our experience of the
mm.
world.
I think that a really important point here, and something that I've become increasingly interested in, especially in debates about philosophy of mind, because I think that it's something that is uh, we're so close to yet so far from, is that the way that you described it there, and the way that you kind of approach qualia with a kind of neuroscientific background, almost it's less like having come up with a neat solution. It's more like having dissolved it by shifting our vocabulary around the question to reveal that a term we thought was necessarily problematic may not be so necessarily problematic after all. Like this phenomenon it may be that instead of there being like, oh yes, we've built this one bridge and it's the hard problem of consciousness, and now we've built it and it's done. It's more like, no. We were locked in a particular way of viewing the world and viewing the problem, and we've shifted the way that we view it slightly. And it turns out that actually this wasn't a thing that needed explaining quite the way we thought it was. It's kind of, I mean, I've thought about changing the tagline to my Substack to dissolving a problem is as good as solving it. So you can tell where I stand on this kind of thing. Actually, I love that kind of vocab shift, dissolution of problem approach. And that seems to be kind of what you're describing. Think if people at home are listening to that explanation and think, oh, that's total rubbish because like I can think about how pea zombies, and I can think about how there might be physical things that are like us in every way but don't have qualia. It's like, well, in some sense, the way that you've just described viewing the mind-body problem broadly construed, and the way that a person's reflecting on qualia using their kind of intuition is viewing the problem, it's not even that you're posing a solution to the problem posed in their terms. It's that this is a different vocabulary through which to approach this phenomenon that we're all struggling with.
Yeah, and I think that like you can see this in a lot of the exchanges that like physicalist philosophers often have with people who I often call them like qualiophiles, people who are really really into the hard problem and think it's an insoluble problem. It often sounds like they're just talking past each other,
Mm,
and I think it comes down to this kind of like just you're conceptually thinking about this in a different way, and so it becomes hard to answer a charge that like doesn't really map very well onto how you think about this.
mm,
Like how do you get experience out of function? It's like, well, I don't know that that's a question that
mm,
has an answer.
mm,
So yeah, this idea of dissolving it, and I think like a lot of philosophy questions are similar to that. Like we should
mm,
be asking ourselves a lot, like, oh, is this actually a question that necessarily has an answer? What is the essence of ultimate reality?
mm.
Like, is
So-
that like we can ask that question? I don't know, like that. There's something that it kind of corresponds to that, like we can say
Mm,
about. But um, so like that's I think an approach that in general we should try to
mm,
adopt when we feel like we run up against an unsolvable mystery. Is like, oh,
mm.
maybe it's not actually something that needs to be solved. Maybe
Yeah.
it's just like we can dissolve it away by taking a different perspective.
Mm. Yeah, and I think that's it, in dissolving it is. I think people sometimes think, oh, dissolving a question, that's just like saying the question didn't matter. It's like no, like dissolving a question is important, right? Because if you're standing in front of a question that can't be solved, and you also don't yet have a way of dissolving it, that's a problem, right? Because it's standing in the way of your future inquiry. I think that we kind of when we talk about dissolving questions, I think some people think, oh, you're just kind of, you're explaining things away. And so, well, sometimes explaining things away is really handy because in explaining it away, you get a whole new set of theoretical and practical terms that you can then use to do very, very exciting things. It's not like, oh, we just forget about the problem. It's like, no, we can actively dissolve it. And that
Right.
may even be more useful than solving it in some cases.
Right. And like it's not that like the question, hey, what is experience? How do we make sense of it? It's not that like I don't think that's um like we should just ignore that or
Mm,
something like that. It's more like how do we approach that in a way that we get traction on it and can break it down. And so like and I think that is something that we can do. I think we can look at different interesting cases. So like the um, uh, attentional neglect that I mentioned earlier, where you're
mm,
just like ignoring half your vision. Like there's something interesting going on there, right? If we can better understand what's going on there and better understand attention, study the mechanisms of attention, um, that that changes how we're thinking about experience. So it's not like, oh, we're just gonna ignore the question. We're just going to shift our thinking on it a little bit, try to get traction on it, and then we'll realize that like the way the question was posed was like not not that it was
mm,
ill posed, but that it was a naive way of conceptualizing what the question was all along. We will
mm,
change our conceptions along the way and break it down into other mini questions and maybe like turn it on its head a
mm,
little bit and, break it up in a few different other ways. And I think that's where things get interesting. To me, like the interesting parts of philosophy of mind are where it intersects
mm,
with the science. I think there's tons of interesting conceptual questions because it's so hard to think about the fact that we are our mind,
mm.
that there are a lot of interesting conceptual questions and it's easy to get yourself kind of tied in knots. You can see this like even in the scientific literature all the time. You see scientists saying things that like um, feel not quite right about like consciousness and uh, that oh this then gets passed on and becomes conscious, and like they just like
Mm.
quickly like right, like there's all these like funky kind of things, and I see philosophers like Patricia Churchland and Daniel Dennett as trying to really engage with what science is telling us, and
Mm.
hey, oh great, like let's try to make up a theory based off of what we know so far. And the great thing
Mm.
about theories is then we can go out and test them, right?
Mm.
And so I think that's how we're going to make progress on consciousness, is through coming up with theories, looking at the kind of tractable, the places where we can get traction, there are cool behavioral tasks that you can do that, right? If you think of
Mm.
the Necker cube is a common one, right? So this 3D
Oh
shape
yes.
that you can either see as going in or out, right? Like
Mm.
you can kind of switch your attention in such a way that you can perceive it as going in and out. There's also like the spinning ballerina that
Mm.
if you change your, you can see it going one way or the other. These are interesting things where like the stimulus is the same, yet our experience of it is different, right? And
Mm.
so using situations like that, we can start to get some traction on, hey, what's going on that's different, that's giving rise to a different experience. And then all of these pathological cases as well, we start to be able to triangulate things so that we're breaking down what we mean by experience in different ways. And gradually we're able to answer all of these sub problems, the easy problems. And then
Mm.
at the end, I don't think there is a hard problem. It's just
Mm.
a bunch of clustered, easy
Mm.
questions that we need to kind of like look at the right way.
Mm. Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. I also think that, I think that philosophers can get quite married to the idea that philosophy needs like a special object of study. And actually, I think some of the most exciting philosophy that I've read and philosophy that I've had the pleasure of discussing with people has been where philosophy is intersecting with another field. So, you talk to a philosopher and a mathematician working together, or a philosopher and a cognitive scientist working together. I mean, I'm biased here. During my master's year, my friend's a cognitive neuroscientist, and we started a logic and cognition reading group, and that's what we did the whole year, and it was really, really good fun. Like, I'm really bullish on philosophy working with other fields.
Oh, I was just going to say, like, there are like these two kind of visions of philosophy and its role, and like there, you get people like Peter Unger has this book called Empty Ideas, and I think it's similar ideas have been echoed by other philosophers that like, hey, are we actually sure we're solving any problems, or are
Mm.
we like doing what Dennett would call schmess?
Mm.
Um, and that's questionable when you're so abstracted away from anything. Like if you're debating about things that don't actually make any material difference in the world, are you actually debating like these definitions, do these
Mm.
concepts actually matter? Um, and then you get like the kind of naturalistic camp that sees philosophy as kind of continuous with science. And that's sort of how
Mm.
I see it. Like I see philosophy as having its own uh, history and training, but ultimately we're trying to do
Mm.
same the same thing. Science and philosophy are trying to understand the world and our place in it. And so you can see philosophy as sort of like uh, close to like a like we have theoretical neuroscience, theoretical
Mm.
physics. It's also like philosophy is kind of on that side with the theoreticians, maybe even like further on the theory side, but trying to like do the same thing. And I think those collaborations can be really fruitful because they have philosophers have different training than
Mm.
scientists. Scientists know like experimental design and statistics. Well, having somebody that has a lot of experience with like making really clear arguments and getting
Mm.
concepts really clear and not getting tangled in knots about it, that's a different skill set that can
Mm.
really push the enterprise forward as well.
Just to sort of round out this interview, what is the most interesting idea that you've come across in the past year?
Oh, geez. Um, all right, so this might not be the the kind of answer you're looking for, but one thing that a book that I'm reading right now is on the history of science.
Mhm.
And it goes from like the pre-Socratic era to I think like the 1400s.
Mm.
And one of the interesting things is reading about even before we had writing. the ways that people would, the kinds of explanations that people accepted are different than they are
Mm,
now. And so people saw things as needing explanations that were more personal and specific to an event rather than like we're used to scientific explanations being, very coming from impersonal forces and
mm,
from general forces, right? Rather than the whims of an individual person would be
mm,
like the kind of explanation that pre-writing. But with the advent of writing, so like the Babylonians started to record the positions of stars and realize, oh, hey, there's actually like a lot of patterns here. And so
mhm,
they started like explaining things in like terms of like, oh yeah, that's there because remember last month it was over there, and so like,
mm,
and we know it follows this pattern. And so from there, there started to be more quantitative predictions. So as we became more accurate with especially astronomical observations, we started to build models that were more accurate. And the whole concept of like being able to predict things, not just explain
mm,
things, like quantitatively predict with a great deal of precision, became suddenly a thing. And so this idea that those explanations that we just kind of take for granted wouldn't even be recognized as explanations to kind of pre-writing people is kind of like, to me, kind of mind blowing and just like reinforces this idea. I've been starting to use this term, conceptual Umwelt, right? So
oh, yeah.
an Umwelt is like, we talk about it with different animals, the different sensory experiences that they're having, the way they detect their environment. So I can be in the same room as, um, you know, a, a mole who's blind but has like a better sense of smell and can feel with their whiskers much better than I can. And we're going to experience that same environment very differently. Similarly, like with people that have very different kind of conceptual ways
Mm,
of breaking down their world, they're just going to experience the world in a lot of different ways, just like we are going to approach the world and understand it in a very different way than these pre-writing people that
mm,
want these more personal explanations. And so I think that's kind of the coolest
mm.
thing I've come across in the last little while.
That's so cool. What's the book called? Sorry.
Oh, The Beginnings of Western Science by Lindbergh.
Ah.
Yeah, really, really excellent book. Goes through like kind of like just enough detail,
Mm,
like uh Plato's Cosmos and Aristotle's and like how they broke this down and like why they broke it down that way. And so it's just like really fascinating to see how this kind of evolved, both like how uh, not just the understanding of the world, but also like what it means to understand the world.
mm.
Uh, how those both evolved kind of in tandem. So to me, that's a really exciting part of
No,
the
that
history.
sounds absolutely fascinating. And where can people find you?
So I am on Substack mostly is where I'm most active. So Cognitive Wonderland is the name of my publication. So look me up or Google Tommy Blanchard. I'll probably come up. Um, yeah,
Fantastic. Thank you so much for being on the show. This was an absolutely wonderful conversation.
yeah. Thanks so much for having me.